Good morning. You have an insert in your bulletin that I'd like to draw your attention to today. This is the precursor for something you'll be hearing more about as we get ready for Rally Sunday in the fall. This is a little bit of a connection card. The connections game, for those of you who like the New York Times game each day, can't be answered unless you listen to the sermon. So that's your challenge. Answers will be announced in next week's newsletter. But there's also some questions for you to ponder, and then full citations for the scripture that I'll be citing in my sermon today. Now, would you please pray with me? Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be pleasing to you, our rock and our Redeemer. There's a particular lament I hear again and again in the church. Maybe some of you have said it yourself. I raised my children in the church. They attended Sunday school. They were confirmed here. We say grace, and we said grace at the dinner table every night. So why don't they go anymore? And what about my grandchildren? What happens to this faith after I'm gone? Underneath those questions, I hear more than concern about church attendance. I hear love. I hear the belief that this church has sustained me, that this community has seen me through times of grief and hardship, that my faith has taught me about hope and forgiveness. It's added meaning to my life. So how do I give that to the people who I love? And there's the problem. Because we can't take our faith and simply bequeath it to someone else. Faith may be the most important inheritance we can offer our children, but we cannot simply hand it down. We cannot bequeath belief. We can leave our children and grandchildren money, jewelry. We can even leave them recipes written in our own hand, but we can't put our faith in a box, wrap it in pretty paper, tie it with a ribbon, and put it in someone else's hands. So how do we pass along something that we can't give away? That question is much older than any of us. In fact, it's hiding inside the story that we just heard from Joshua. The Israelites knew this worry too. They were surrounded by other gods. They had just left behind the polytheism of Egypt. Now they were entering Canaan, a land filled with its own gods. Throughout the book of Joshua, there's an urgency about this. How would Israel remain faithful to the one true God, Yahweh, the God who had delivered them? How would they pass their faith to children and grandchildren who hadn't crossed through the Red Sea with them, who hadn't passed through 40 years in the wilderness to cross the River Jordan, who hadn't seen the miracles of God? In the Bible story we just heard today, God gives them a wonderfully tangible answer: stones. Let's look more closely at today's Bible story. Most of us already know the story of the parting of the Red Sea, perhaps thanks to Charlton Heston in the Moses movie. But Pharaoh's army was bearing down on the Israelites, and they escaped slavery from Egypt only when the Red Sea in front of them was miraculously parted by God. God told Moses to stretch out his hand over the water. The waters miraculously divided, and the Israelites walked across dry ground to safety. But did you know that 40 years later, it happened again? You do after Dale's reading this morning. By this time, Moses had passed away, and Joshua is leading the people. After 40 years of wandering in the desert, the Israelites can finally see the land that they had been promised. There's only one problem. The Jordan River is in the way. So God tells Joshua to send the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant down to the Jordan River, and they don't stand safely on the bank waiting for the water to move. They step in faith. And Joshua tells us at that very moment, when their souls if the soles of their feet touch the water, the river stops flowing. And once again, God's people cross through dry ground. Think about that. The Israelites' journey out of Egypt began with the passing through water. And then their 40-year wilderness journey ends the same way, with God making a path through the water. God does not want them to forget it. So God tells Joshua to construct a memorial. 12 men, one from each tribe, walk back into that exposed riverbed. Each one bends down, picks up a stone, hoists it on his shoulder, and carries it to the other side. 12 tribes, 12 stones. Joshua takes those stones and sets them up at Gilgal. We still do this, don't we? If we hike in the woods, especially when the trail becomes difficult to see, you may see a pile of stones left by someone who traveled that way before you, a cairn. It says, someone has been here before. This is the way. Across cultures and across thousands of years, people have raised stones to say, something happened here. Don't forget. The Bible has a wonderful word for stones like these. Dale said it in her opening prayer. It's Ebenezer. In the book of Joshua, or actually in the book of Genesis, we hear the story of Jacob's dream. When he awakens, he says, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. Then he takes the stone that had beneath his head, and he sets it up as a pillar. Later in the Old Testament, the prophet Samuel sets up a stone after God delivers the people and names it Ebenezer, the Hebrew word for stone of help. Samuel says, the Lord has helped us. In our concluding hymn today, Come Thou Font of Every Blessing, we will sing the line, Here I raise my Ebenezer. An Ebenezer is a memory made visible, a marker that says, God met me here. That's what the stones beside the Jordan were meant to do. Except there's something curious about stones. They're just rocks. They don't tell any stories. A child could run past them. Visitors could go by having no idea what they mean until someone asks, what do these stones mean? And then the remembering begins. Perhaps our lives are filled with stones like these. This is where I encountered God, right here in this sanctuary, or in a winter storm in 2007 when I didn't know how I would get through. This is a time I almost lost my faith. These are the stones we carry from the riverbed of our own lives. But simply piling them up is not enough. Joshua tells the Israelites that when their children see the stones and ask about them, they must tell them what they mean. That is the work of spiritual memory. We remember, we interpret, and we tell. Of course, telling stories can be complicated. We live in a time where many of us have learned to be careful about imposing our beliefs, even on our own grown children. We respect their independence. We don't want to interfere. We certainly don't want to be that mom whose phone calls their child and it lights up and their child says, oh no, mom is calling me about going to church again. So we wonder, what do we say? How do we know which stories to tell? And how do we know when the right moment comes to tell them? I've carried those questions with me while I was writing the sermon this week. And along the way, I realized there's a clue that we all witness together here every year. Worship no longer holds an undisputed place in the architecture of American life, and on Sundays, we often have an empty pew. Yet Christmas comes, Easter morning dawns, and people fill our pews. What is it about our sacred stories and traditions and all those memories that have the power to draw us back? Because it's not just our church that quadruples in attendance on those high holidays. A 2025 Lifeway survey found that 90% of Protestant pastors said that Easter and then Christmas were their highest attendance days. Anyone want to guess the worship service with the third highest attendance? Mother's Day. That's right, Rhodes. Why? I think it's because Christmas, Easter, and Mother's Day gather together a powerful mix of things that we as human beings cherish. Sacred meaning, a pause from our relentless schedules, and family tradition. The Pew Research Center found that 7 in 10 Americans have attended a religious service on Christmas. So our neighbors and our children who may pass through months of Sunday mornings without walking through these doors, come at Christmas time because a memory has awakened. This is where we belong. Grandpa is here. The sanctuary glows with candlelight. Mary and Joseph make their way to Bethlehem once more with the babe wrapped in swaddling clothes who will change the world. The organ begins to play the first notes of Silent Night, and suddenly everyone remembers every single word. Easter has its own memories. Beautiful lilies, the Hallelujah chorus, crowded pews, Grandma's ham at home afterwards, and those famous words that we proclaim, Christ is risen. Christ is risen again. Memory is remarkably durable, like stones. Traditions may change, habits may fade. Still, somewhere in our bones, the memory of God's goodness remains, even when we aren't quite sure what to do with it, and suddenly Joshua 4 doesn't seem quite so ancient. Our children aren't standing beside the Jordan every week, but the stones are still there. I'd like to share a personal story this morning. My family treasures an old diary kept by my dad's grandmother, my great-grandmother Wege. I never knew her. I know her only through the words that she left behind. Much of her diary records the routine details of everyday life, the weather that day, work that needed doing, small happenings of home and family. Nothing that she would have imagined anyone standing in a pulpit 100 years later talking about. But woven through those pages is a story of a woman of abiding faith. She writes about the years after her husband died, when she was raising her children as a widow during the Great Depression. She tells of a time when the elders of her church learned that she needed a new roof and helped her pay the almost unimaginable sum of $70. She tells another story about a young man named Daniel. Work was scarce in those lean Depression years, but Dan had managed to find some. And knowing that this widowed mother was struggling to feed her family, he came to her and gave her $1 to buy groceries for the week. That kind young man eventually fell in love with her daughter, married her, and years later, I simply came to know him as Grandpa. I never heard Grandma Wege's voice. I never sat at her table and watched her bow her head in prayer. I never had the chance to ask her what it was like to lose her husband, to raise children during the Depression, to worry about whether there would be enough money for food, or how she would ever afford a new roof. But she left her words. And through them, I know that church mattered to her. And more importantly, I know why. I know something about the faith that sustained her. When $70 might as well have been $70,000, when she needed a roof over her children's head, I know that the elders of her church showed up. I know that during a week when groceries were uncertain, provision arrived in the generosity of a young man who had earned $1. Grandma Vriki could have never known that someday someone might read her words, but she raised her Ebenezer. The psalmist says, "We will tell the coming generation of the glorious deeds of the Lord." Remember, interpret, tell. So let's return to our three wonderings. What is the answer to the question, what do I say? Friends, tell the next generation about your life because you lived it. Tell them why you still remember the Sunday school teacher or the pastor who made you feel like you mattered. Tell them about the prayer that you whispered in a hospital room or in a battle when there was nothing left to do but pray. Tell them why you came back to church after months or even years away. Tell them about the person who showed up with flowers, about the person who provided a new roof or gave you $1 for groceries and taught you about God's loving provision. Friends, we do not have to lecture on what faith should mean to them. We simply tell them what faith has meant to us. This, of course, may be challenging, so we look at our next question: how do we know which stories to tell? Because we haven't crossed the Red Sea. We haven't had someone buy a new roof for us from the church. Our lives may seem too ordinary to be worth passing down. But here's what I've come to believe. The stories that reveal who we are often hiding inside of memories that we almost never think to share. The first time we saw our parents cry, the job that we didn't take, the friendship that ended and we weren't quite sure why. We're aware, of course, that memory has this way of sugarcoating our lives. If we have enough years, we soften the rough edges, we paint a pretty picture, even at the sake of accuracy. We remember that Christmas dinner sparkling with crystal and laughter, but we forget about the argument in the kitchen beforehand. We remember the funny family story that we share every year, but we neglect to tell about the years before when that relationship was hard. Sometimes we turn our struggles into neat little stories with happy endings, but they really weren't so neat at the time that we were living them. Theologian and pastor Frederick Buechner understood this. In his memory, Now and Then, he writes that he looks back over his life for patterns and signals that we easily miss when we're busy living our lives. He explains that God speaks to us largely through what happens to us. So Buechner listens back over his life for the sound, above all else, of God's voice. I love that, listening back over our lives. It's a gift of growing older, and we need to take advantage of those gifts when we find them, right? Spiritual memory asks more of us. It asks us to look again with eyes to see, to remember what was beautiful, yes, of course, but also what was painful and difficult and challenging. And then to ask, what did this teach me? The Gospel of Luke tells us that Mary treasured these words and pondered them in her heart. Maybe that too is part of spiritual memory. We treasure what happened, ponder, wonder what it meant, and only years later do we recognize where God was walking alongside of us. because the footprints of God may be clearest in the places that we are tempted to smooth over. The problem that became a teacher, the disappointment that changed our direction, the person who we struggled to love but stretched our patience and our understanding of God's grace. Friends, stories don't require us to live extraordinary lives. We storytellers simply need eyes to see the sacred within the lives we are actually living. Remember, interpret, tell. And our final questions: when do we tell our stories? I keep coming back to one detail in Joshua that I find surprisingly tender. God doesn't command the Israelites to force their faith on their children. God simply says, when your children ask. There is patience in that. There's respect. Leave the stones where they can be seen and be ready when the questions come. Of course, the questions that our children ask may be different than what do these stones mean. They sound more like, how did you know that Dad was the person you wanted to marry? Were you scared when you lost your job? Did you ever doubt that everything was going to be okay? Questions are invitations for us to tell the truth about what shaped us, what carried us, and where we found God along the way. Because I believe they will ask, perhaps not this Sunday, perhaps not this Christmas, perhaps not for 20 years. God's timing is known only to God, and his horizon is often longer than our limited vision. So for those of you who are saying, Christine, I may not be here in 20 years, I also believe, my friends, that we can simply leave the story where it can be found. We can write it down, put it in a birthday letter, tuck it into the family Bible. Grandma Vriki left hers in a diary, and 100 years later, I found it. Israel had already seen God make a path through the Red Sea. Then 40 years, they wandered in the desert. Maybe we as God's people sometimes mistake a wilderness season for the end of a story. The River Jordan says otherwise. God is still moving. New generations are still asking questions. People are still coming to the water. We may never know who may someday need our stories or when. And perhaps that's where our faith comes in. We tell what is ours to tell, leave the stones, and leave the rest to God. Our faithfulness is not measured by whether people believe exactly as we do. Their story belongs to them and ultimately to God. We interpret, we tell, raising our Ebenezer and leaving our stones where they can be found. Then we trust God, who guided our ancestors through the waters and the deserts. We trust God, who makes paths in our own lives. And we trust God, who will still be there when another generation comes looking for the way.